Shashi Tharoor, thank you very much for joining us.
Good to be with you, Michael. Pleasure.
Let me start by saying, how is India positioning itself in the new world order following the election of Donald Trump and Brexit?
Well, I think as far as the election of Donald Trump is concerned, we haven't reacted with a great deal of alarm because there's a widespread perception that that Indian-American relations are on a very, very even keel, that they've acquired a certain stability, they've been buttressed by the extremely politically influential Indian-American diaspora community, which is both strongly present and visible in America and is at the same time very committed to seeing their motherland grow and prosper. So all of these things, and the fact that in the last 20 years or so we've seen bipartisan goodwill. Both Republican and Democratic presidents have been friendly to India. India felt that they didn't have to worry about the outcome of the presidential election and that whoever won, Indian-American relations are going to be okay. There is a little bit of a worry, however, about Mr. Trump's statements about H-1B visas and immigration, because obviously one of the key things that India has been able to benefit from is America's thirst for the kinds of services, IT expertise and so on that Indians provide. And I'm told that an unofficial estimate is that about 70% of all H-1B visas are actually given to Indians. So the fact that Mr. Trump is talking about severely cutting them back and placing new restrictions on how they can be used may affect Indian companies and Indian nationals disproportionately as a result. So we're waiting and watching all this with bated breath, and I think some lobbying is going on. Some of the private groups like NASSCOM, which is the National Association of Software Companies and Manufacturers, they're sort of out there lobbying the US Congress to say, don't do this, it won't be in the interest of the American consumer or of their own member companies and so on. But by and large, not too much alarm or worry about Mr. Trump. As far as Brexit is concerned, it's in one way an opportunity, in another way a cause of alarm. An opportunity because, of course, a Britain that pulls out of the EU could conceivably start working towards trade agreements of a bilateral nature with a country like India or with other countries in the Commonwealth. And if this means special treatment for India on certain issues on which the EU as a whole has not been terribly helpful to us, then I think we might well be quite happy to work with Britain on this. But if the other side of Brexit, the anti-immigrant attitude, means further tight restrictions on students coming to India, the costs for students coming from India to Britain, the costs for these students, their right to stay on for temporary work visas to gain professional experience before going back to India. If all of these things remain tight or get tighter, then I'm afraid Brexit will be seen as bad news by India.
So India would insist upon a loosening of immigration policies toward Indians, to do a free trade agreement with Britain?
Well, I think if we're looking at a bilateral free trade agreement, obviously you want conditions that other people don't enjoy. So if Britain has a tough global anti-immigration stand, but for specific categories of Indians, makes an exception. It can be students, it can be professionals, it can be doctors and nurses, it can be IT people, it can be service providers, Indian companies providing services in Britain. If those things are written in, I think India would be receptive. But if they are not written in, what else do we have to offer? I mean, there's some Indian goods we can sell you, but there's only so much tea you can drink in Britain. You know, we are better at offering you services and people. And if you don't want them, then I'm not quite sure I see the basis for a very effective bilateral free trade arrangement.
Can we go back to the US for a moment? Donald Trump's America First rhetoric may have been dialed down just a little in recent days, but it's very much a central part of his policy. Is there a risk that jobs in India will be lost because of the insistence of Trump and his administration of bringing back jobs to the US?
But we're all parsing what America First means. But we've heard him say in the State of the Union address that he wants to celebrate those companies that are bringing jobs back into America. Now, many of these jobs aren't in India yet. Many of the jobs he's bringing back would be jobs that are in places like China. Or there would be jobs which in some ways have gone to countries with which America has other kinds of agreements. But as far as India is concerned, if American companies were contemplating setting up new factories or new establishments or new software sort of parks or farms, as it were, in India, particularly in response to Prime Minister Modi's Make in India drive, it's quite likely that they may scale back their plans or even cancel them, in terms of Mr. Trump's preferences. And the worry there, therefore, is that not only will America First mean that some of the older jobs may go away, and there are not too many of them in India, but that new jobs will not be created. And that's what really India needs, because we've got this youthful population coming of age, heading towards the job starting age group and looking for new opportunities, which Mr. Modi had hoped he could provide them through massive foreign investment in new enterprises in India. And if that doesn't happen from America, it may not happen from a whole lot of other places either.
Let's look at India now. You were a very strong critic of demonetization, not just the policy, I believe, but also the way it was implemented.
Particularly the way it was implemented.
But Modi has not had a huge hit in terms of poll ratings as a result of it. Are you surprised by that, and how do you explain that?
Well, to some degree, it's class envy and resentment, I think, because, 70%, and I mean that, 70% of the Indian electorate consists of people who live on less than $2 a day. Many of them suffered greatly. Not because they had black money, but because they were daily wage workers who lost their jobs, because they were working in small and micro enterprises that had to shut down for lack of capital, because there were farmers and peasants who couldn't get money to buy seeds, and people at the bottom of the chain did suffer. But they seem to have perceived that it's the fat cats, the rich people who had lots more money, including black money that was not accounted for, who really took a hit. And good old Indian envy kicked in, and they said, we may have suffered, but they've suffered more. Haha, why should we punish Mr. Modi for that?
So does that surprise you?
It does.
Yeah.
It does because, like all the opposition parties, my party had analysed the problem as one that might be a windfall opportunity for us, that the government had essentially scored an own goal. That it had, in fact, by doing something that clearly would cause a great deal of short-term difficulties for the economy and for real human beings working in that economy, that it would therefore suffer the political consequences thereof. Today, as we speak, we don't know ultimately, because the 5 state polls that are taking place to assemblies in 5 states we'll only know their results on the 11th of March. But up to now, the jury is out, and it certainly doesn't seem as if Mr. Modi has suffered. Certainly in smaller elections, that is elections to municipal councils and village councils, his party has actually done better in the states of Maharashtra and Odisha than in the previous elections 5 years previously. So given that, it does suggest that it hasn't hurt him, but I think the 11th of March will give us the definitive answer.
Finally, let's look at the global picture. Are we at an end of a liberalised global economy? Is globalisation now seriously under threat, or is this a pause? Will globalisation continue? Will it regain the momentum it had?
I'm not one of those who's in despair about this, Michael. I think that there is an anti-globalization backlash, undoubtedly. Mr. Trump very clearly represents that tendency. Many of the Brexiteers were against the consequences of too much global integration with foreign countries. And the popularity in France of a Marine Le Pen or in Netherlands of a Geert Wilders all represents the same tendency, and there are other less consequential examples in other countries as well. But in every single case, these people represent a minority. The exception would be the Brexit vote, but it was about a lot more things than globalization. And even there was a lot of buyer's remorse after the results, when people flocked onto Google search to find out what exactly they voted for. But Mr. Trump, as you know, 7 million more people voted in America against Mr. Trump than for him. 3 million for Hillary and 3.5 plus for other candidates for president. And candidates like Marine Le Pen and Geert Wilders are very clearly unlikely to actually come to power in their countries, even if they emerge as the largest single party in the case of Mr. Wilders, or as the first in the first round, as in the case of Ms. Le Pen, because I don't think that's going to translate necessarily into adequate support to actually assume the reins of power. So I would say that the globalizers have been given a warning shot across the bow, but with the need to be attentive to the concerns and insecurities of some of their voters, particularly blue-collar workers thrown out of jobs. I think the basic consensus that the world has moved irreversibly towards greater integration, I think will not be reversed. I hope not to be proved wrong, and I certainly believe I will not be proved wrong, but I think that some of the things that we've been saying for 25 years, that globalization is here to stay, remain true. But very clearly the existence of a backlash points out to all of us the importance of being able to moderate the effects of some of our decisions on global economics in a way that the people who we are directly accountable to, our voters, are aware of and responsive to what we're trying to do for them as well, and not just for the shareholders of the big companies or the bottom line of the fiscal deficit or all of those good things that finance ministers pay attention to, that we also need to be attentive to the needs of the common man and woman who fears for their jobs and their future. If we can strike the balance, and there's no reason why we shouldn't, I think the integrated globe we've been taking for granted for the last 25 years will, in my view, continue for the next 25.
Shashi Tharoor, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.